Whoa, everybody's really looking fresh. So hopefully you all had a good evening yesterday. Um, well, let's get started with the first session of today. And well, hopefully you all had a good coffee and a little bit of energy left because we are going to dive deep for the upcoming 45 minutes. So buckle up. Please, well, spare up your questions for the session or after the session. Sal's going to stick around, but we are really going to need that 45 minutes to, well, wrap it all up. So please, let's get Sal on stage and give him a warm round of applause.
Hello? Okay, awesome. Thank you all for coming to my session, Bypassing the Gate, a deep dive into Gatekeeper flaws in macOS. I'm excited to be here from Toronto, Canada. My name is Ferdal Saljuki. I'm a security researcher here at Jamf Threat Labs, where we analyze malware and build detections for the Jamf Protect product. We also occasionally report vulnerabilities to Apple. And today I'm here to talk about several Gatekeeper bypasses that we've reported to Apple, affecting Safari, archive utility, launch services, as well as bypasses we found in third-party software such as the Unarchiver. Throughout the presentation, I'll cover some detections, high-level detections you can leverage with Apple's endpoint security. But I have a lot of content to cover here today, so I'll go ahead and get started. So what is Gatekeeper? Gatekeeper is a security feature built into macOS that ensures that only trusted software runs on the system by verifying code signing and notarization information. And notarization is a review process in which a developer submits their software to Apple, where it is scanned for to ensure it's free of malicious code. And as you can see on the prompt here, Gatekeeper blocks any unsigned or revoked applications from executing. So this is the prompt that you typically expect to see when attempting to execute any unsigned or ad hoc signed application. So today we'll focus on a number of bypasses to get around this functionality altogether. So let's just cover some of the legitimate scenarios in which a developer may want to distribute their application for testing purposes and may not want to completely sign it. They'll have to override Gatekeeper if they want their app to run after it leaves their system. So you might be familiar with these already. One of the common techniques, you could clear the quarantine attribute. This is an extended attribute that's applied to any downloads from the internet. So this is a Gatekeeper's way of determining something is downloaded from a remote source. We'll spend a lot of time on that throughout the presentation, so I'll get into that. Social engineering, what I like to call the right-click open method, that you essentially right-click and open an application to override Gatekeeper. This is by design. This is intentional. And Gatekeeper will actually prompt you with a scary-looking prompt when you attempt to do so. And then you can, of course, disable Gatekeeper altogether using the system policy control command. So before I get into all the Gatekeeper, let's just get a recap of some of the malware we've seen and analyzed and how they're getting around Gatekeeper. So, like, this is real stuff in the wild that we've seen. So cracked applications are one of the easiest ways for malicious actors to get into user systems. And in this case, you have a disk image of an unsigned application that it might be hard to see, but there's instructions for the victim to override Gatekeeper by going to system settings and allowing the application to open once you execute it. And then in this case, the malware prompts the user for their credentials and runs as root. And then there's multiple stages involved in this malware. But essentially, what is the purpose of this malware? Well, the final payload was a backdoor that can run any script with administrator privileges and replace the Exodus and Bitcoin crypto wallets installed in the machine with infected versions that stole the secret recovery phrase the moment the wallet was unlocked. So pretty clever. Next, we have Rust Bucket. This is APT malware that's been attributed to Lazarus, or rather Blue Neuroff, which is a subgroup of the infamous Lazarus group. And this is malware that we've named Rust Bucket, and we found, and it's pretty. Like you could see here, it's an unsigned internal PDF viewer application, and they have these PDF documents that are a single page and indicate that in order to view the sensitive contents of this PDF document, you must open it in this PDF viewer application. So you might be wondering, so how is it getting around Gatekeeper? It's unsigned. Well, the attackers actually provide a PDF document with specific instructions on how to override Gatekeeper. And yeah, this was undetected at the time when we were analyzing this. And the stage 1 is an applet that runs some Apple script code to retrieve a stage 2 payload. And the stage 2 is also called internal PDF viewer. And the stage 2 actually does operate as a PDF viewer application. So if you're looking for a PDF viewer to use, then this might be one. I'm just kidding. But there's nothing malicious that happens at this stage. This is something that was interesting because the PDF actually acts as a key. When you load in the PDF, it goes into a specific offset within the PDF to DXOR a URL that's going to retrieve the third stage payload. And that's where the malicious stuff happens. The third stage is a pretty capable backdoor that collects system information. It grabs the running processes on the system every 60 seconds, sends it to the C2, and it can download and run additional payloads or self-terminate if it's on a system that it's not interested in. We've seen many variants of Rust bucket. Obviously, that one was written in Rust, hence the name. We've seen variants written in Swift that were actually signed and notarized. And of course, Apple can quickly revoke the certificates. So we have seen that in the past. Another clever technique we've seen from DPRK is leveraging scripts. So in this case, attackers engage in conversation to build and gain the victim's trust by pretending to be a possible investor, targeting victims over Telegram or LinkedIn. And the attacker requests the individual's Calendly link so they can schedule a call. But on the day of the call, they say that, oh, there's something wrong with the link, it doesn't work. And they said that they're going to reach out to their IT support. And their IT support gets them to like, oh, this is the solution, you can run this script. So when double-clicking on this script file, it actually opens it in Script Editor, which is pretty clever because Script Editor is a built-in application on macOS. You could, build Apple script. You can build JavaScript for automation. And in this, they have like a comment box saying like, please press the button above to troubleshoot the issue. And when they hit that play button, do you think you would get a Gatekeeper prompt? No. So they're leveraging this because they want to get around Gatekeeper. And the code is pretty simple. Like, it just goes to a URL, curls it down, whatever's sitting at that URL, the script, and it just sets it to the variable SC, and then it just runs it. So no Gatekeeper prompt, pretty clever technique. And then more recently, we've seen Thief Bucket malware that we've attributed to North Korea. And in this case, a user was contacted on LinkedIn by an individual claiming to be a recruiter on an HR team at a tech company that specializes in decentralized finance. The recruiter sends a zipped coding challenge to the target, which came in the form of a Visual Studio project, and it gets the victim has to complete this. And when they open this project in Visual Studio, it's pretty clever because they just have to build this project, and inside the build, some of the builds commands inside the Visual Studio or in the C# project, it goes and runs this bash command to go and retrieve a second stage, and their system is essentially compromised at that point. And of course, it prompts the user for their credentials and then has a bunch of information stealer logic built in. So you could see some of the commands that were built into this. So that at that point, it's up to Visual Studio to prompt the user that, hey, you're downloading or you're running something that came from a remote source. And Visual Studio does prompt when it comes to that. But these are some of the techniques we've seen out in the wild. So let's get into some previous Gatekeeper bypasses before we dive into some of the ones that we'll be covering today. So Apple double files. So researchers at Microsoft discovered a way to persist important file metadata through a mechanism called Apple double. And you can think of it like what happens when you move a file to a different file system. The metadata needs to be preserved. So Apple has come up with the Apple double mechanism to do that. So Apple double saves the metadata in a different file side by side next to the original file with a __ prefix. So when the file is archived along its original file and then extracted by macOS, those extended attributes are fully restored. So they leverage access control lists. So they set very restricted ACLs on the files, so that when you download this file through Safari, it's not able to actually apply the quarantine attribute because of these ACLs, and that metadata was preserved through the Apple double mechanism. So you can see here, like just an example of trying to set an or write an extended attribute, and just gets permission denied. And then other researchers found ways that, well, you can leverage ACLs with Apple Archives. It's a dedicated archive format that Apple provides, and that actually preserves that metadata. So using the same technique with a very restrictive access control list, and create an archive with Apple Archive. I'll be getting into Apple Archive throughout the presentation. We've seen Gatekeeper bypass through symlinks, where you build Open Automator, build an automation script, export that automation as an application, and you replace the stub binary that's located here with one that's under the system library core services. So it just becomes a symlink. And then downloading that from the internet will bypass Gatekeeper. We've seen Gatekeeper bypasses scripts as applications. Malware such as Schlaer has actually abused this in the wild. And this technique is pretty simple. You just have a shell script with no info.plist, and you just want to make sure that the main executable, typically you'd have a mock-o, but in this case, it'll just be a shell script. And then downloading this from the internet, packaging it and downloading it from the internet, users simply double-click on it, no Gatekeeper prompts whatsoever. And yeah, there's some Schlaer malware that's actually has a shell script embedded within it, but you could see here that this is not signed, and it's just getting the user to double-click on it. So let's get into the Safari Gatekeeper bypass. So I have a little demo here to illustrate how that works. Just wanted to highlight that by default, Safari has this feature built in called Open Save Files that's enabled. And here I downloaded this application from Safari, simply double-click on it. In this case, I just had it to pop calculator, and you saw no Gatekeeper prompt whatsoever. So this was actually an interesting scenario. We actually discovered this vulnerability through a website called itch.io, where indie game developers can share games, and users can just download these games and support these independent developers. So what we noticed was typically when you download an application from the internet, you expect to see that quarantine attribute on all the items, like on the app bundle and all the files and folders within it. In our case, when we downloaded this through Safari, like from that itch.io website, we were actually looking for malware, and we ended up finding a vulnerability. There was no quarantine attribute on the main component of the or the main app bundle itself. So we thought that was strange. Maybe it's signed. No, it doesn't turn out it's not signed. It's not notarized. There's no quarantine attribute on the app itself, but the quarantine attribute is on like the executable. So we're like, okay, so the quarantine attribute is being applied, but somehow it's being applied incorrectly. And this issue was specific to Safari. Other browsers did not have that issue when we were in our testing. So this is the key point I want to mention. So this feature is enabled by default in Safari, Open Save Files, and essentially auto-extracts archives for your convenience, like zip and gzip archives. It gets auto-unzipped, and then you have your application, just saves you one extra step. But that auto-unzipping process is what ultimately led to this vulnerability. So how is it that this developers of this game are getting around Gatekeeper? Well, it turns out itch.io provides this command line tool called Butler, where developers can push new builds, apply patches, and just manage new versions of their game. So we decided to create an account and upload our game or upload an application, a test application to this Butler using this Butler tool. So here we have a standard zip file that we created through the command line and one that was created through the Butler. And then one thing that you noticed that immediately stood out to us was the root of the zip header for a standard zip is pointed at test.app, but the one for the Butler zip file was pointed at test.app/contents. So we thought that was quite strange, but we want to replicate this behavior. And we can simply remove all the bytes from the first zip header to the second zip header in a standard zip file. And then, of course, downloading this from the internet was that indeed actually bypassed Gatekeeper. So they were crafting this archive in a way, we're not sure if it was intentional or not, but this was what we observed. So how was it that this website was accidentally bypassing Gatekeeper? To better understand the issue at hand, we first need to have some background on the BOM or bill of materials and how that plays a role in extracting the archive. So these objects are used in many different places by Apple to keep a running list of file paths when a major file transaction occurs. For example, if an individual sends a directory to another user over AirDrop, a temporary BOM file is created. And that's created on the sender system that holds a record of all the files that were sent in that transaction. So BOM items can even be saved to files in binary format with the make BOM command. Under the system library receipts directory, it holds a list of BOM files as well. And the name of the BOM file tells you which software was installed and by what application. And you can see which different files were created by that software using the ls-bom command. So as mentioned earlier, if the quarantine attribute gets applied to files and folders under the test.app directory, Gatekeeper is not triggered. The application itself is all Gatekeeper looks for. So we determined that the easiest way to confuse the bill of materials function is by ensuring that the root of our application was not in the first local file header of the zip file. So in this case, the application downloaded from itch.io were able to bypass Gatekeeper checks because the root of the application was not contained with the BOM, within the BOM during extraction of the archive. So to craft this, we can simply create an application and create a zip archive for that application. The key thing here, we actually found you don't actually need to remove all the bytes from the first zip header to the second. You can actually just run that zip command. Instead of pointing it at test.app, you point it at test.app/contents, and that will ensure that the first local file header of the zip is the test.app/contents, and that will ensure that the quarantine attributes only apply to that folder as well as the files within that folder. And then there you can see some proof of concept code. So yeah, and then here's just a demonstration. Like you can see, like if I pointed at test.app contents, this is how the quarantine attributes are being applied. If I pointed at test.app contents macOS, you get the point here. It only applies it to the files and folders within it when we download it from the internet. So far we've covered how we're able to get around Gatekeeper due to an issue in the BOM or bill of materials for when an archive is being extracted. We're able to see how critical the quarantine attribute is in order for Gatekeeper to perform its checks. And in this case, we saw the quarantine attribute being applied incorrectly, which effectively resulted in a bypass of Gatekeeper. Now we can look at how we can detect this by monitoring rename events using Apple's endpoint security. So we can just look to see if there's a rename event where the process is the com.apple Safari sandbox broker, which is responsible for handling the unarchiving operation. Then we check, we verify if the file has an app extension, since we care about application bundles in this case. And we can also check for the .download extension, and we look for renames from that .download temporary folder to the destination folder, which in our case is going to be the user's downloads folder. So as a final optional check, we can look up the extended attributes on that final renamed application to verify that there's no quarantine attribute applied to it. And this ultimately would trigger our detection successfully in the case of an exploit. Now let's get into the archive utility Gatekeeper bypass. This is another vulnerability that we reported to Apple that allowed us to bypass Gatekeeper via the archive utility application on macOS. So after reporting our findings to Apple, they credited us with this new CVE. When downloading a specially crafted archive and extracting it with archive utility, we're able to bypass all of Gatekeeper's checks again, and this resulted in an unnotarized and unsigned application being executed with no prompts displayed to the user. So let's see. So let's compare the two CVEs at a high level. So using the AAA utility, as we mentioned earlier, for creating an Apple archive, we can actually, in a similar command syntax, we can create an Apple archive that will allow us to bypass Gatekeeper when we download this archive from the internet. So although these commands look somewhat similar, this new vulnerability is completely unrelated to the Safari one, and the Safari vulnerability affected the bill of materials, as we mentioned, with the open save files feature enabled. So 2 separate CVEs here and 2 different commands that you can exploit this. So just a quick recap on or a little information on Archive Utility. It's an application built into macOS on their System Library Core Services. Archive Utility supports a number of archive formats. And in our research, we just focused on the Apple Archive, denoted by the AAR file extension. This vulnerability is not specific to Apple Archives, but in the exploit section of the talk, we'll cover how we can craft a zip archive in a similar manner. So when downloading Apple Archive from the internet, you can see by default, Archive Utility is the application that is going to handle that. So what is Apple Archive? So Apple has a proprietary archive format known as Apple Archive, and it allows for multi-threaded lossless compression of directories, files, and data, including file attributes. So using the AA command that's built into macOS, we can create and extract archives. But in our case, we want to create various archives to get around Gatekeeper. So let's take a look at the following directory structure. We have a folder named images, inside that folder named photos with a few images. This has nothing to do with images, I'm just using this as a demonstration. So when we use this Apple Archive command to create an archive and point it at the directory images, it archives all the contents within that images folder, excluding the images folder itself. That's important, I'll get into that a little later. So what happens, okay, we just created this archive, we downloaded it from the internet. Okay, what do we expect to see? This is how the quarantine attributes are applied. Great, that's what we expect. com.apple.quarantine attributes being applied to all the downloaded items. Okay, so now what happens when we add one additional image, but pointed at, we add one additional image at the root of the images directory, so 4.png, and we use another archive using that same Apple Archive command. And then we download it from the internet. Let's see what happens here. So we see the quarantine attribute being applied to almost all the items, except there is 2 things that happen here. There's a new folder called My Pictures that we never added in the original archive and we never created. And this folder doesn't have a quarantine attribute applied to it. So let's take a look at why this My Pictures folder does not have a quarantine attribute applied to it. So as we recall, we only noticed this behavior when we added the 4.png photo. So as it turns out, when extracting an archive containing 2 or more files or folders in its root directory, Archive Utility will create a new folder based on the specified archive name. So in our case, the root directory of our archive contained a folder named photos and a file named 4.png. And when our My Pictures archive was unpacked, Archive Utility created a new folder named My Pictures containing our extracted items. So presumably this feature exists to prevent, like, imagine you have hundreds of files that you're extracting. It's all going to extract into your downloads directory. It's going to be inconvenient, so Apple's like, well, we'll just create a folder for you, and you can have all your files there. So there are a number of processes that are involved when extracting an archive. This includes Archive Utility, Archive Service, AU Helper Service. Let's start by looking at Archive Service. So Archive Service is a process writes extracted contents to a temporary directory located at the path prepended with the name NSRD Archive Service. Within this temporary folder, it will hold our extracted archive file and folders. Here we can see our photos folder as well as various images that we've included. So Archive Service will actually aim to apply the quarantine attribute to all of the extracted items. It does this by calling a function titled propagate quarantine information. as part of the BAW decompressor class. This function is responsible for propagating the quarantine attributes to all the extracted contents of the archive, and it invokes a low-level function called quarantine file applied to path to apply the quarantine attribute to that temporary directory. So this is what that looks like in that temporary directory. The quarantine attributes apply to the photos, the images, photos folder itself, but not on the temporary directory. And we'll look at why that's important when it's being renamed. So AU helper service process invokes a function titled decompress move copy results to move the extracted contents from the temporary directory to its target destination. And this is typically the user's downloads folder. So taking a look at some of the disassembly for this function to determine what's happening, the function first retrieves the path to our extracted archive located in our temporary directory, and then retrieves the path to our downloaded archive, and then the file name of our archive is extracted from the path. The file extension of our archive is removed, and the non-quarantine temporary folder holding our unarchived files is renamed to its destination folder. So as a result, our My Pictures folder does not have a quarantine attribute applied to it. So how can we exploit this? So simply placing an application within this folder will not result in any success, as it will hold the quarantine attribute. So however, as we learned from the Safari Gatekeeper bypass, when it comes to application bundles, Gatekeeper only cares if the quarantine attribute is applied to the app itself. So it disregards recursive files within that app bundle. So if we ensure that our non-quarantine folder is an application by adding an app extension, we can craft an archive in a way to bypass Gatekeeper checks. So you can see some of the requirements for exploiting this to bypass Gatekeeper. And yeah, we ensure that the unarchived file, so we can name our archive like test.app.aar. So we have that test.app folder created for us. Then we have an application bundle. macOS will recognize it's an app bundle. So to exploit this, we have an application named toxic.app. We need to ensure that all of the conditions for exploitation are satisfied. There should be 2 or more files or folders in the root of our target directory. And we only want to archive the contents within our application, as we don't want toxic.app to have our quarantine attribute. And using the AA utility, this is already accomplished for us, since it does not include the target folder in the archive. And simply, we can just name our archive as toxic.app.aar with the Apple archive extension. So let's break down what's going on behind the scenes. So user downloads this archive from the internet, and archive utility is going to be the one that's going to spawn AU helper service as well as archive service. So archive service is responsible for creating that temporary directory. It begins to unarchive everything into that temporary directory. So archive service will apply the quarantine attributes as well to all of the extracted items in that temporary directory. And it's important to note here, it did not apply the quarantine attribute to that temporary directory itself, which is very important. And then AU helper service then takes responsibility to rename that temporary directory. And it's using the archive name, removing that extension, and it's going to apply that to that temporary directory. And then finally, we have a toxic.app. macOS recognizes that's its application bundle, and then simply just double click on it, bypass Gatekeeper checks. So as we mentioned, it's not specific to Apple archives. We actually found a way you could do this with zip archives. You just change directory inside the toxic.app. You could use the zip-r command and just use the same toxic.app.zip name, but just will only archive the contents inside of that directory. So you can craft a zip archive in the same way to bypass Gatekeeper checks if you wanted to use that instead of an Apple archive. So after reporting our findings to Apple, they quickly patched the issue by updating the propagate quarantine information function. They added additional call to quarantine file applied to paths so that the temporary directory pre-appended with that NSIRD archive service now contains a quarantine attribute before it is renamed. These are some detections that feel free to take a picture. If you want to leverage Apple's endpoint security, you can look at rename events and how you can go about monitoring this. Let's take a look at another vulnerability that we reported to Apple that affected launch services and allowed for a Gatekeeper bypass. So when you download an application from the internet, as we already mentioned, this is the prompt that you typically expect to see on the left. It can't be opened. You simply move to trash or cancel. The prompt on the right is what you expect to see when you have a legitimately signed application, right? And this is actually the prompt that we saw in our bypass. So our application was not signed, and we had that prompt. So something was wrong. Let's look into this. So the vulnerability, actually, the way we triggered it was using something called a file lock. A file lock is an internet location shortcut file that can be used to open existing files, binaries, or any other file in the system. It has a plist format and provides quick access to opening files by double-clicking on the shortcut file. So you can see a shortcut file here. Actually, it might be a little hard to see, but it opens foo.doc. So you simply click on the shortcut file. You want to open this document under temp. So that's how you achieve that. So we thought, what happens when you point it at a unsigned application? So you leverage this file lock. What happens when I instead of pointing at a document, point it at an unsigned application? And it turns out that you get a prompt as if your application was signed, even though it is completely unsigned. So this is exactly what we saw. It says dark mode is an app download from the internet. Are you sure you want to open it? You have the option to open it now, even though it's unsigned. Application launches. So Apple actually quickly patched this before we even had the chance to report it. So it's possible that someone at Apple realized the mistake and quickly fixed it before anyone really noticed. But we were determined. We wanted to find a different way to leverage this. So we decided to create this disk image. So it's a slightly different approach. And this actually involves taking our unsigned application dark mode, placing it in the applications folder, but this time we have that same shortcut file, but we wanted, you can now drag and drop it over an icon in the dock. So you can use, I don't know, applications that exist in the dock like Safari, Notes, Mail, and you'll get that same prompt as we've seen here. So let's dive into this a little bit. So running the open command, as shown on the screen here, will result in the same Gatekeeper prompt we've seen with the vulnerable file lock approach. And this is what we are essentially doing when we drag and drop our application that points to dark mode.app over Safari. We are instructing launch services to open our unsigned dark mode.app using Safari in this case. So investigating the issue in Safari, it triggers a function name is quarantined and not user approved, which incorrectly prompts the user, allowing them to open the application even though it is unsigned. And upon allowing the application, the quarantine flags are updated and the application will be allowed to launch. And as we saw, how it's very important for that com.apple.quarantine extended attribute will be an indication for Gatekeeper that this has been downloaded from the internet and should be inspected to ensure it's safe to be open. So we already, so this issue is actually not specific to Safari, and it relates to how launch services opens all applications. So in a debugger, attaching to the open command from earlier, we can identify some of the functions that may be responsible for this issue. The ls open items with handler makes a call to ls quarantine message set allow unsigned. So Apple has made several logic changes in macOS 14 where they patched this issue with how launch services opens applications. And one of the more notable changes is in ls open items with handler, where it made improvements with the checks performed for unsigned applications. So this issue has actually been patched in macOS 14, and the quarantine flags are now they're no longer being updated in order to bypass Gatekeeper using the file lock methods that we've shown. All right, promise this might be the last vulnerability that I'll be covering today. So what is the unarchiver? This is a third-party application that's used for archiving applications as well as extracting archives. It supports many different archive formats, and it's installed on macOS systems as an alternative to the archive utility by macOS. So users might want to download this application. It's actually very popular, and in order to support various other archive formats that archive utility doesn't. So at Jamf Threat Labs, we always continue to monitor different ways and how attackers might want to bypass Gatekeeper, and we always try and stay a step ahead to try and identify these vulnerabilities before attackers can leverage them and abuse them in the wild. So as we mentioned, this is an application bundle. You expect that quarantine attribute to be applied to all the items. In our case, when we crafted an archive and extracted it with the unarchiver application, there was no quarantine attribute applied to the root of the application. So instead, we observed the following quarantine attributes when we crafted an archive and extracted it with the unarchiver application. So the following is the bash script, and in this case, we're using a zipx extension. You could use any extension. The only reason we use a zipx extension is because we want the unarchiver application to extract our archive by default. If we have zip, then it's possible that the archive utility built into macOS might extract it. And the key thing to point out here is the way we craft this archive to bypass Gatekeeper checks. Again, we're using that same zip command that we've covered previously, and we just want to point it at foo.app/contents. So let's look at why this is happening. So the quarantine attributes are not being applied to the foo.app application, only to the files and folders within that. So we reported our findings to MacPaw's product security team, who patched the vulnerability and assigned it this following CVE. So the root cause of the vulnerability was actually in the XAD master library, which the unarchiver uses for creating and extracting archives. The XAD master is an open source Objective-C library used for archive creation, file unarchiving, and extraction. So the vulnerability existed in the XAD unarchiver and XAD simple unarchiver classes, where upon extracting our crafted archive, it would set the root directory at the path. It would create the root directory at the path without propagating the quarantine attributes. So in the patch version, the code checks if a delegate is set, and if so, calls the delegate method. This method notifies the delegate that the directory has been successfully created. It then triggers the function write clonable metadata to path, which is responsible for writing metadata such as the quarantine attribute to the newly created directory, ensuring that all quarantine attributes are applied when unarchiving. MacPaw also created a GitHub advisory and patched this issue in version 1.10.8. So any developers that are using this library, this open source library, are encouraged to update to the latest available version. So lastly, just wanted to highlight some of the changes to Gatekeeper in macOS 15. Apple has explicitly made it more difficult for malware to execute. They know that, as we covered throughout in the malware section of the talk, attackers are getting users to right-click open their applications to override Gatekeeper through social engineering. And Apple's noticed that, and now users have to explicitly go into system settings to approve those applications. So it involves a little bit more steps from the user's side, and hopefully makes it more difficult for attackers to achieve unauthorized code execution on the system. So key takeaways: Gatekeeper is an excellent security feature built into macOS that helps prevent malicious or untrusted software from executing on a system. But it's not perfect, and it has its flaws, as you saw from today's presentation. Most of the logic bugs that we discussed today involved manipulating and crafting a malicious archive in a way where the quarantine attribute was not being applied correctly, leading to a complete gatekeeper bypass. Therefore, it's very important to leverage behavioral detections and monitor for when archives are extracted that contain an application and verify the legitimacy of that application via various means, such as checking code signing information and checking to see if that's like an application you typically expect to see on a user's system. And this typically would be useful having a threat hunting team that actively monitors such detections to identify signs of like exploitation. So just to recap what we covered a number of vulnerabilities. If you want to read in blog form in more detail on some of the vulnerabilities that we've covered here today, you can do that on the Jamf Threat Labs website, where we posted details of all these vulnerabilities. And just want to point out, all these vulnerabilities have been patched, and there have been no in the wild exploits to our knowledge, and we've been actively monitoring for that. Some of the write-ups, and thank you very much for attending my session.